Thanks everyone for coming out this morning. Thanks for having me to give this talk in this section towards a wearable perspiration senso. I'm actually here on behalf of my group and specifically the person who did a lot of this work, and I want to give him kind of a shout out right to start. Murat Yokus. He couldn't come thanks to the awesome political climate and the loss of his visa and ability to travel back and forth from the States. So this is very much for him. He put in a lot of time and effort into this work. Was looking forward to coming, but very recently couldn't. So I'm here on his behalf and behalf of the group and the folks who did this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing in on-body sensing, wearables, specifically looking at biochemistry. So to match the other half of what a lot of the research is out there, which is electrophysiology. So you'll see a lot in wearable EKG, EMG, EEG, thin film devices, and we're starting to see a little bit more in the biochemistry. And so we'll talk about an enabling technology for the biochemistry. So to get us started, just a quick background, and we've seen a lot of these different components, talked about them, some of them earlier today in terms of pH sensing. So we're looking at sweat sensors or perspiration sensors. So you see all of these kind of nifty devices that are doing either standard electrochemical measurements, so glucose sensors, lactate sensors, right, enzyme-based sensing, maybe some fancier amino assays integrated into glasses, thin film patches. Most recently, I'm sure a lot of you may have seen work coming out of UC Berkeley in terms of these multiplex sensors and multiplex systems, thin films wrapped on the body, right, to really get this good feel of what biochemistry is going on internally, specifically metabolism usually, and that's what we're looking at in most of these biochemical sensors. What you don't see so much, or you kind of have to dig around, is for how these tests are performed, how the characterization is performed. Not a joke, it's people running marathons in Death Valley. That's the lower left-hand side one, right? It's people on a treadmill in a climate-controlled environment. It's people on a bike, right? So fairly high perspiration rates. If we look at the average person hanging out, sedentary, you have a set perspiration rate. It's usually in the nanoliters per minute, depending on area of the body, surface area, about per square centimeter, where you're measuring this. You could get up into the hundreds of microliters, milliliter per minute, per square inch, per square couple centimeter area during strenuous activity. But most of us aren't doing consistent strenuous activity, and even if we are, there becomes a bigger issue, which is sweat rate versus biomarker concentration. You don't sweat at a steady rate, usually. So if resting, active, resting, right? Anaerobic versus aerobic exercise, alter sweat rate. And one thing that a lot of these biomarker or biochemical sensors use as sort of a platform or a check is electrolyte levels. So they'll look at sodium, chlorine, maybe calcium depending on the use case, potassium usually. Well, these concentrations in sweat directly change based on sweat rate. So if you don't have a good monitor of sweat rate or a correlation with your electrolyte concentration, you're going to have trouble saying this is a correlation to blood glucose. This is a correlation to blood lactate levels. Realistically, you want to look at tissue lactate levels, but in either case, this correlation becomes a little bit trickier in how you make that measurement and how you assess that measurement. So when you have high sweat rates, things like sodium and chlorine reabsorption is limited by high sweat rates. So you're going to see a lot more of it being produced in the analyte you're measuring, right? Or the sweat that you're measuring, which could also affect your sensor. So knowing this is an important calibration step. More importantly, it's an important marker of metabolism and performance of the sweat gland or the cooling of the body, right? We chose sodium and chlorine to talk about in this kind of presentation because the concentrations increase fairly linearly with strat rate. So it's a decent comparison, and it's an easier calibration than looking at glucose or lactate or some of these other outputs. And so the current clinical practice for measuring analytes and sweat, there's really only one major known test, and that's for infants and measuring cystic fibrosis. Also adults or preteens and things like that, looking at cystic fibrosis if symptoms persist. And that's the Macroduct sweat collection system. It's an ionophoretic system. You're basically using current to cause sweating with pilocarpine. So you're driving a drug in that induces sweating and extracting that sweat through a little microfluidic system. You pull it out, you know the general volume within a ballpark, what you could extract from the system, varies dramatically from person to person. We try to use these as controls, but we use an adult population, and we could get anywhere from 1 microliter to a full 100 microliter sweat sample. Some people we can't get them to sweat out of standard places, upper arm, lower arm, thigh. And it's just kind of the way the skin and how your body's set up. And what you'll do is you'll extract that fluid, stick it through another instrument. It does a conductivity measurement and says, yeah, high chlorine content usually, what you're looking for in cystic fibrosis, right? You can't reabsorb chlorine. It's a symptom. So can we create a wearable miniaturized perspiration sensor? We're not particularly interested in cystic fibrosis. We're interested more in now gauging or giving you a measurement for the other wearables you want to build. So we want to look at flexible, small, accurate, and continuous measurement of total sweat loss and sweat rate. So we can calibrate our other sensors, and then also we could look at general performance, heating, temperature, and kind of just body performance over time. So if we want to look at conductivity of sweat versus sweat rate, the idea is we want to correlate sweat conductivity, which is related to the sodium and chlorine concentration predominantly. There's some small fluctuations in potassium and calcium that could cause changes, to sweat rate. So on the left side, what you see here is the concentration of sodium chloride in solution versus conductivity. It's fairly linear, nice and linear, right? And then sweat rate versus sodium and chlorine concentration. And depending on the top line, that's actually a cystic fibrosis patient, and the bottom is your control. We have a nice, relatively linear trend. Someone with cystic fibrosis doesn't have that trend, and so that's how you would diagnose cystic fibrosis. So we're looking at these two linear trends of concentration and conductivity and sweat rate versus concentration. And so by measuring those, we can correlate the two. And so we could look at conductivity and correlate that to sweat rate for a person. So to start this effort, we went and we did the now, I'll say famous or infamous squiggly line trace microfab, right? So we have encapsulated traces that are pretty much stretchable unidirectionally. We have them set up in a capacitive pairs that are then encapsulated, right? So they're not exposed at all. And then we attach them to an absorbent layer. So in some cases, it could be paper microfluidics. You could have other thin film microfluidics. We have some nanofiber work that would do the sweat absorption and the fluid handling on body. So we fabricated 3 different sizes, small, medium, large, just to kind of look at the array of capacitive sensors or impedance electrodes. And so we looked very simply in an in vitro characterization of impedance versus sodium chloride concentration at different frequencies. And basically with increasing sodium chloride concentration, we see a change in impedance with as well with decreasing sensor size. So the solution resistance is more or less dominant, greater than 100 kilohertz. The impedance of sodium chloride is inversely proportional. The impedance and concentration of sodium chloride are inversely proportional. So what we can do is we could take those basic electrodes, that basic principle, right? Conductivity goes up, impedance goes down, and we could build a simple on-body system, right? Wireless, and basically do EIS on-body. So we have our simple analog front end, an RFID, Bluetooth low energy microcontroller wired up with these electrodes. We can put it on an on-body patch. It's about kind of 2x1, 3x2-ish bandage size patch right now with a LiPo battery. And we can start making monitors of human perspiration sensor. The first thing we did is we kind of characterized our on-body system in kind of a benchtop platform. So we took at 100 kilohertz sensor size. We used the smallest sensor size because we're trying to miniaturize everything. And what we see is we're sensitive to the sodium chloride changes in a physiological range. So you kind of get the whole plot here. The inset is for our flexible perspiration system, sort of on body. And then what we want to do is compare it to a benchtop system at very low concentration, so requiring higher sensitivity. Our sensor wasn't that great, and we have to work towards improving it and pairing it up. When we got to higher sodium chloride concentrations at the high end of what was physiological relevant, so at the high sweat rates, right, the easier ones to measure when you're exercising, working out, and so forth, we had good comparisons. So we still have a little ways to go to kind of increase our sensitivity at the lower sodium chloride concentrations, which is at rest, essentially, if you think about it that way. And so we want to do a response to simulated sweating as well. So looking at flow rate and fluid volume change over time passing through our paper microfluidic. And what we see on the left side is a set fluid volume with a variation in flow rate, so a variation in sweat concentration. And so we see a variation of flow rates determines how long it will take the measured resistance to reach its final value. So by basically looking at time gating, we could say this is the sweat rate that's occurring passing through our paper microfluidic. And then if we hold the flow rate constant, we don't see any major change, so the impedance value is independent of the fluid volume. So what's good about this is we can start looking at a correlation of electrolyte concentration, sweat rate, and sweat volume. And really it becomes a calibration and a signal processing or a time gating issue. So if we can properly time gate when the impedance reaches its final value, we know the sodium chloride concentration, and then we also know the sweat rate. And from that, we'll know the volume of sweat that's being produced and the volume of sweat you would be doing your analysis on. So the effective sweat rate can be differentiated, but it's physiologically tied to the electrolyte concentration. So that's very important. So these aren't just arbitrary. This is the sweat or the electrolyte concentration that's coming out. This is actually tied to the performance of the sweat gland, to the performance of the individual person. So it's much more important to look at sweat rate and sweat volume than just sodium chloride concentration coming out, if you want to make some type of diagnostic or prognostic measurement from these sensors. So in future work, we want to integrate these impedance sensors with some microchannels, so different microfluidic devices, so we can precisely control the volume. And like we showed, if we control the volume, then we have a better reference point to look at the sweat rate and the sweat concentration. We basically reduce one of our variables. And we're actually moving on very shortly into human subject trials later this fall and into the spring to test these on some adult patients at rest and exercising. So with that, I'd like to thank my group. You see on the left there, Dr. Alper Bozkurt's group, the iBionics lab, EC and BME, which I'm part of, and really importantly, the three students that kind of drove this project, Murat, who I mentioned earlier, Cheyanne, and Talha, who is here, and the NSF Nanosystems Engineering Research Center ASSIST, which is basically, check us out, it's assist.ncsu.com. It's a center at NC State that's really dedicated to wearables and energy harvesting and wearable sensors. And with that, I think we have a couple minutes. I'll take any questions.